My sister and brother and I, we always used to go off and camp and pretend we were, stranded with just our animals for company. And it takes you into a sort of multitude of different worlds.
In the heart of Buckingham Palace, hidden behind locked doors, lies a collection of jewels that once belonged to Princess Diana, symbols of love, grace, and legacy. But when these priceless treasures began to vanish, a deep betrayal was uncovered, shaking the monarchy to its core. As whispers of missing jewels turned into shocking revelations, one name emerged at the center of it all, someone no one ever suspected. This is the untold story of stolen treasures, shattered trust, and a family's desperate fight to protect the memory of a beloved princess. Prepare for the truth behind the royal scandal.
But I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become.
Diana's jewels are not just pieces of precious metal and stones. They are symbols of her life, her legacy, and her deep connection to the British people. These jewels hold memories of significant moments, state occasions, charity galas, royal tours, and quiet private moments with her sons, William and Harry. For the royal family, especially Diana's children, the jewels are more than just beautiful accessories. They are precious reminders of their mother's spirit. For years, these items have been safeguarded by a small, dedicated team of staff members responsible for the care and protection of the royal collection. They are experts in preserving the integrity of the royal legacy, handling each piece with care and respect. But what happens when something goes wrong? When a piece of this collection, especially one so closely tied to Princess Diana's memory, goes missing? This is the question that began to circulate quietly through the hallowed halls of Buckingham Palace. It began with a simple observation during a routine inspection of the royal collection room. An attendant, trusted with the responsibility of cataloging and maintaining the royal treasures, noticed that one item was missing. The diamond and sapphire brooch, which had been worn by Princess Diana on numerous occasions, was no longer in its designated case. At first, the absence was dismissed as a possible mistake. Perhaps the brooch had been removed for cleaning, or maybe it was being prepared for display at an upcoming event. But when the request for its removal was not logged in the inventory book, doubts began to creep in. The meticulous records that had always ensured the jewels were tracked and protected were now incomplete. The attendant, who had worked in the palace for years, understood the importance of discretion in these matters. Yet, the growing concern about the missing item prompted her to make a quiet note of the discrepancy and continue with her duties. Over the next few weeks, the situation worsened. 2 more pieces, each with its own well-documented connection to Princess Diana, went missing. One was a pair of pearl drop earrings that Diana had worn during a charity gala in 1995. The other was a delicate bracelet that had been given to her by a Middle Eastern royal family during a tour. Both were valuable in their own right, but their true worth lay in their association with Diana, the woman whose legacy continued to resonate within the royal family and beyond. To most people, the absence of a few items might seem trivial. However, to those who understood the history of these jewels, their disappearance was nothing short of alarming. The pieces were not just pieces of jewelry. They were deeply personal relics, tangible links to a woman whose impact was still felt every day. And now, these links were slipping away, unnoticed or ignored by the very people entrusted with their care. As the weeks passed, whispers began to ripple through the staff. The tight-knit group of palace employees, trained to be invisible yet ever watchful, began to question what was happening behind the palace doors. Were these jewels being loaned out without proper documentation? Were they being sold in secret, their disappearance hidden by those who had access to them? Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, was the first to hear about the growing concerns. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a state banquet, a trusted attendant approached her with a cautious tone, mentioning a small inconsistency in the jewelry log. As someone who had always held Princess Diana's legacy close to her heart, Catherine immediately felt a flicker of alarm. She understood the sentimental value of the pieces that were now missing. These were not just valuable heirlooms, they were part of Diana's enduring story, a story that Catherine herself had become a part of. Later that evening, Catherine requested to see the inventory book herself. Sitting in her private study, she carefully examined the records, cross-referencing each missing piece with photographs that were attached to the log. The pieces were not obscure items. They were well-known, instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with Diana's public life. The diamond and sapphire brooch, the pearl drop earrings, and the bracelet were all part of a collection that was held in the highest regard by both the royal family and the British public. The fact that they were unaccounted for was more than troubling. It was disturbing. Catherine quickly realized that there had been no official requests for these items to be loaned out or removed for cleaning. In fact, there was no record of them being moved at all. They had simply vanished, slipping through the cracks of the palace's meticulous system. As she sat in her study, the weight of the situation became heavier. These weren't just missing items. They were precious relics, symbols of Diana's life and legacy. The idea that they could be lost without explanation was inconceivable. That night, Catherine shared her concerns with her husband, Prince William. His reaction was immediate, his expression tense as he listened to the details of what had transpired. William, too, had always been deeply protective of his mother's belongings. For him, these jewels were not just valuable assets. They were intimate reminders of the woman who had raised him. For them to disappear without explanation was a betrayal of the memory he held so dear. Together, they agreed that they needed to take action. Catherine began making discreet inquiries, speaking to staff members who had been in service long enough to know the ins and outs of the royal collection. She asked questions about the security measures in place, about who had access to the jewels, and about any irregularities that might have been overlooked. The answers she received only deepened her concerns. There were no clear answers, but one thing was becoming increasingly apparent. Someone with the right authority had removed these items. They had been taken, deliberately and without a trace. In the following days, Catherine's investigation grew more urgent. The missing pieces were not just valuable heirlooms. They were deeply entwined with the story of Princess Diana. They symbolized the connection between mother and son, a bond that remained strong even after Diana's tragic death. For Catherine, the disappearance of these pieces was more than a logistical issue. It was a violation of the memory of the woman whose legacy was still so present in their lives. And someone within the palace had crossed a line by allowing these jewels to vanish. As the investigation unfolded, Catherine began to realize that the answers were not going to come easily. But one thing was clear. Something was happening within the palace walls, and it was happening in the shadows. The royal family had always been a symbol of stability and tradition, but now it seemed as though that foundation was being eroded from within. And so, the search for answers began, setting in motion a chain of events that would change the course of history, expose hidden betrayals, and ultimately test the very heart of the monarchy. As the days passed, Catherine's concerns grew. The missing pieces from Princess Diana's jewelry collection were no longer just an isolated issue. They were a significant breach of trust. Diana's jewelry was not merely valuable. It was part of the royal family's history, cherished by those who had known her, and more importantly, by her sons. To lose such items, especially without a trace, felt like an affront to her memory. Catherine's initial instinct had been to address the issue quietly, as any other royal issue might be handled. However, the more she dug into the matter, the clearer it became that something far more serious was at play. As she reviewed the inventory logs, she began to realize that the missing pieces weren't just misplaced or forgotten. They had been intentionally removed from the collection, and this was something Catherine could no longer overlook. What started as a simple inconsistency now felt like an unfolding scandal. The idea that this might be happening under the very nose of the royal family was deeply troubling. After William and Catherine discussed the matter further, they decided it was time to dig deeper. The pieces that had disappeared were not obscure items. The diamond and sapphire brooch was one of the most recognizable pieces of Diana's jewelry. She had worn it on numerous occasions, and it had become iconic not only because of its beauty, but because of its personal connection to Diana and the royal family. The pearl drop earrings, which had been worn by Diana at one of her most celebrated charity events in 1995, were another deeply significant item, and the bracelet, given to her during an official royal tour, held particular sentimental value due to its origins in the Middle East, symbolizing Diana's unique ability to build connections across cultures. The loss of these jewels had sent shockwaves through Catherine's mind, and as the days passed, she found herself becoming more and more consumed by the investigation. She had to get to the bottom of it. She knew she couldn't simply leave it to chance or allow it to be swept under the rug. This was Diana's legacy, and it needed to be protected at all costs. Catherine decided to approach the matter discreetly, speaking with a select few within the palace staff who were familiar with the collection and who might know more about the history of these pieces. One of the first staff members Catherine spoke to was an older employee who had worked at the palace for decades. The man, having worked with the royal jewels for years, knew them intimately. His role was to ensure that the pieces were cataloged correctly, and he was responsible for handling the security of the collection. His response to Catherine's inquiry was cautious but revealing. He confirmed that there had been some irregularities over the past few months. He, too, had noticed certain pieces being handled in ways that were unusual, but he was reluctant to speak out at first. Like many employees in the royal household, he understood the delicate nature of these matters, and discretion was paramount. However, as Catherine continued to ask around, she learned that the missing items had been removed under the guise of normal palace business. There were no records of loans, no official requests for cleaning or valuation. The jewels had simply vanished, and no one could explain how or why. This wasn't a simple mix-up. It was a deliberate act. And the fact that it had gone unnoticed for so long only made it worse. The longer Catherine thought about it, the more she realized that the items had been taken with purpose, with the intent of being sold or hidden away. The turning point in the investigation came when Catherine found herself sitting in her private study one evening, reviewing more documents related to the missing pieces. Her mind raced as she examined the details more closely. She had already checked the records and found nothing. There were no official requests for the items to be moved, no paperwork that could explain their disappearance. But then, a seemingly innocuous piece of information caught her eye. There was a small notation in the inventory log that referenced an upcoming charity auction in Monaco. The mention was brief, and there was nothing to suggest the auction had anything to do with the missing jewels. However, it was the word Monaco that stood out to Catherine. She knew of the auctions held in the Principality. They were exclusive, high-profile events where rare and valuable pieces often made their way into the hands of private collectors. Catherine's curiosity was piqued. Could this be a coincidence? Or was there something more to this auction? She decided to look deeper into the matter, starting with a search for images from the Monaco auction. What she found shocked her. One of the missing pieces, the diamond and sapphire brooch, had appeared in a catalog for the auction, listed among other prestigious items. The auction house had done its best to obscure the piece's royal connections, focusing instead on its distinguished provenance, a thinly veiled attempt to hide the true nature of the brooch's history. But the images were unmistakable. The brooch in the auction catalog matched exactly with the one once worn by Princess Diana. Catherine's pulse quickened as she scanned the auction details. The brooch had already been sold to a private collector. The price had been staggering, but more than the financial details, it was the connection to the royal family that was impossible to ignore. She immediately reached out to one of her trusted associates in Monaco, asking for more information about the auction and its buyers. She was determined to find out how Diana's jewelry had ended up there and who was responsible for its sale. Days later, Catherine received a reply with further details. The letter mentioned not only the brooch, but two other pieces, the pearl drop earrings and the bracelet. both of which had also surfaced at private auctions. As Catherine examined the photographs of the auction events, she noticed something that stopped her cold. There, in the background of one of the images, was a familiar figure. It was a senior aide from the palace, someone who had never before been involved in the handling of royal jewels. Catherine's heart sank. This was the link she needed to uncover the truth. With this new information in hand, Catherine shared her findings with William. His response was one of restrained fury. For him, the matter was deeply personal. These were not just valuable heirlooms. They were the tangible connections to his late mother. He had always been protective of Diana's memory, and to see her jewelry sold off without his knowledge was an affront to everything he held dear. But even as his anger grew, he knew that they needed to proceed carefully. The situation was delicate, and making any hasty decisions could backfire. Over the following days, Catherine instructed a small team of trusted individuals to monitor auction houses, both in Europe and beyond. The goal was simple: to track down any more missing pieces and uncover who was behind the sales. Within days, more discoveries were made. The pearl drop earrings had appeared in a catalog for an exclusive auction in Geneva, described as coming from a distinguished European collection. The bracelet had been sold to a London-based dealer known for discreet transactions with wealthy clients. Each new discovery only added to the sense that this wasn't just a random theft. It was an orchestrated effort to sell off pieces of immense historical and sentimental value. Catherine knew that she was getting closer to the truth, but the situation was far from resolved. She had enough evidence now to begin connecting the dots, but there was still one major question hanging over everything. Who was behind this elaborate scheme? Whoever was orchestrating the thefts knew exactly what they were doing. They had access, confidence, and the ability to hide their tracks. But Catherine was determined to find out who it was and why they had decided to cross such a line. As Catherine continued to investigate the disappearance of Princess Diana's jewelry, she felt the weight of the task growing heavier. What had initially seemed like a small inconsistency was rapidly unfolding into a much larger conspiracy. Each new discovery only deepened the mystery, and the more she uncovered, the more she realized that this was no random theft. The missing jewels were part of a calculated, orchestrated effort to remove them from the royal collection and sell them off in secret. The moment that had truly ignited Catherine's concern was the discovery of the auction listing for the diamond and sapphire brooch. That single piece had been sold at a prestigious auction in Monaco, and its sale had gone unnoticed until Catherine's careful investigation. But there were still other pieces missing, and they had all been removed with the same meticulous planning. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that the thefts were not the work of a rogue palace employee or a random outsider. Whoever was behind the scheme had to have had both the access and the authority to carry out such a complex operation. With this in mind, Catherine knew that she needed to dig deeper. She began focusing on the connections between the missing jewelry and the auction houses where they had been sold. The auction houses were exclusive, high-end establishments, catering to an elite clientele. Only those with significant wealth and influence could afford to purchase such valuable pieces. The fact that several items had surfaced at these auctions suggested that this was no simple act of theft, but a deliberate plan to sell these priceless jewels to private collectors. Catherine's next step was to contact her trusted network of contacts in the world of high-end auctions. She needed to find out who had been bidding on these pieces and who had bought them. As she made calls and sent emails, she also began to gather more details about the sales themselves. The auction listings, she discovered, were carefully worded to avoid revealing the true provenance of the pieces. The diamond and sapphire brooch, for example, was listed as coming from a distinguished private collection, but there was no mention of its royal history. The same was true for the pearl drop earrings and the delicate bracelet. The descriptions were vague and intentionally misleading, designed to obscure their true significance. Catherine's next breakthrough came when she received an unexpected letter from an associate in Paris. The letter was addressed to her in a casual tone, but as Catherine read it, she felt a rush of excitement. The letter mentioned a private auction in Monaco where a striking sapphire and diamond brooch had appeared in the catalog. The letter's author, a well-connected individual in elite circles, had recognized the brooch as one belonging to Princess Diana. She had assumed that the piece had been loaned out by the royal family for charity purposes. But as Catherine now realized, the auction had been anything but a charitable endeavor. The mention of the brooch in the auction catalog was a key piece of information. Catherine immediately began searching for images of the auction, and soon found a photograph of the event. There, in the background, was a familiar figure, a senior palace aide, someone who had never before been associated with the handling of royal jewelry. The aide was standing near the auctioneer, conversing with one of the bidders. It was the connection Catherine had been waiting for. The figure in the photo was someone she knew personally. This was the first tangible lead that could connect the palace to the sale of Diana's jewelry. The discovery sent a shockwave through Catherine. She knew that this person, this aide, must have been involved in the removal of the jewelry from the royal collection. But what role had they played in the scheme? Had they been acting on their own, or were they part of a larger network? And more importantly, who else was involved in the sale of the pieces? These questions began to occupy Catherine's every waking thought. She realized that she needed to tread carefully. If she acted too hastily, she risked alerting those involved and jeopardizing the entire investigation. After consulting with William, Catherine decided that they needed to proceed cautiously. The situation was delicate, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The next step was to gather more evidence, but this time, they needed to be more subtle. Catherine instructed a small trusted team to keep a close eye on auction houses and private dealers in the coming days. She knew that the pieces that had already been sold might not be the only ones that were missing. More jewels could be out there, waiting to be discovered by the right buyer. As the investigation continued, Catherine's unease grew. She had learned that several of the missing items had surfaced at auctions, but there were still questions about who was behind the transactions. The auction houses were known for their discretion, and they often dealt with wealthy clients who valued privacy above all else. The fact that these pieces had been sold without raising any alarms was deeply troubling. It suggested that those involved had not only been able to remove the jewels from the royal collection undetected, but they had also managed to launder their provenance and sell them to buyers who had no idea of their true origin. It was during this phase of the investigation that Catherine made another critical discovery. She had been reviewing correspondence from a trusted palace contact when she came across a series of emails between the royal jeweler and an external appraiser in Geneva. The emails referenced the missing jewelry pieces and contained valuation details that matched exactly with the items that had disappeared from the collection. The appraisals were dated just days before the pieces had been listed in the auction catalogs. Catherine's heart sank as she realized the significance of what she had just uncovered. The appraisals were not merely routine assessments. They were part of a deliberate effort to move the jewels out of the royal collection and into the hands of private collectors. At this point, Catherine knew that the thefts were part of a much larger operation. The pieces had been carefully removed from the collection, appraised, and then sold at private auctions. The fact that the jewels had changed hands so quickly, without any attempt to return them to the royal family, was an undeniable sign of intent. But who was behind it? Who had the power and the access to orchestrate such a scheme? Catherine knew she was getting closer to the truth, but she also understood that she needed to proceed with caution. She couldn't afford to make any rash decisions. The more evidence she gathered, the more she realized that the situation was far more complicated than she had first thought. She was dealing with a network of individuals who were both well-connected and highly skilled at covering their tracks. But Catherine was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deep the conspiracy ran. The next step in the investigation was crucial. Catherine had gathered enough information to begin making connections between the missing pieces and the individuals involved in their sale, but she needed to be certain before taking action. She knew that the evidence would soon point to someone within the royal family's inner circle. But who could it be? Who could have crossed the line and risked everything for a few priceless jewels? In the coming days, Catherine would discover that the answers to these questions were more shocking than she could have ever imagined. The web of deceit stretched farther than she had anticipated, and the person at the center of it all would be someone no one had expected. But for now, Catherine's focus remained on one thing: finding the missing pieces and ensuring that Diana's legacy would not be tarnished by those who sought to exploit it for personal gain. As Catherine delved deeper into the investigation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in ways she hadn't expected. She had gathered all the evidence she could, and now it was clear that the stolen jewels were not simply the result of a random theft or careless mistake. This was something far more deliberate, and the scale of it was only beginning to emerge. The items had been taken with purpose, moved across borders, and sold through exclusive high-end auction houses to private collectors. But the question that remained was who was orchestrating this elaborate scheme, and why? The more Catherine thought about it, the more the answer seemed to point towards someone with the power, influence, and access to move these pieces without raising suspicion. Someone within the royal circle. As she continued to piece together the timeline and connections, it became more and more apparent that the person behind this was not a low-ranking palace employee, but rather someone higher up, someone with both the authority to move the jewels and the opportunity to cover their tracks. Catherine knew that she needed to confront this person, but she also knew that this wasn't a simple matter. The royal family was a tightly knit institution, and every decision had consequences. This was not just about missing jewelry. This was about betrayal, trust, and the very fabric of the monarchy itself. Whoever was responsible for this scandal had not only stolen from the royal family, they had damaged the legacy of Princess Diana. For Catherine, this was more than just a matter of recovering the stolen jewels. It was about protecting the memory of the woman who had become a symbol of compassion and grace. The discovery that someone from the royal circle was likely involved was a shock to Catherine, but it also made sense. The jewels that had gone missing were too valuable, too personal, for anyone outside the palace to have access to them. Only someone with insider knowledge would have been able to remove them without triggering any alarms. And that person, as Catherine soon realized, had to be someone who had both the means and the motive to carry out such an audacious plan. Catherine's first instinct was to move quickly, to confront the person responsible and bring them to justice. But as she considered her options, she knew that any rash actions could backfire. The palace was a place of immense power and influence, and bringing this matter to light could have far-reaching consequences. Catherine also knew that William, her husband, would have his own views on how to proceed. He had been protective of his mother's legacy for years, and the idea that someone within their own family had betrayed that legacy was almost too much to bear. But despite his anger, William also understood the need for caution. After much deliberation, Catherine and William decided that they needed to bring this matter to the king. It was clear that the situation had gone beyond what they could handle on their own. If they were going to confront the person responsible, they needed the full weight of the monarchy behind them. The king, though deeply conflicted, was the only one who could make the final decision. He was the ultimate authority in the royal household, and only he could take the necessary steps to deal with the betrayal at the heart of the family. It was a late afternoon when Catherine and William made their way to the king's private study. The weight of the task ahead was heavy on their shoulders, but neither of them could avoid the truth any longer. As they entered the study, they were met by the king, whose face was drawn and solemn. He had already been briefed on the investigation, and it was clear that the discovery had shaken him. The loss of Princess Diana's jewels was not just a personal matter for William, it was an affront to the monarchy itself. Catherine wasted no time in laying out the evidence before the king. She showed him the correspondence, the auction catalogs, and the appraisals that had been made for the missing pieces. She explained how the pieces had been moved out of the palace, sold through secret channels, and finally surfaced in private auctions. The king listened carefully, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the details. William, too, stood by his wife's side, his hands clenched at his sides as he fought to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't just a betrayal of the family, it was an attack on Diana's legacy, something that William would protect with everything he had. When the evidence had been presented, the king sat back in his chair, his mind clearly racing. He had always known that the royal family was surrounded by intrigue, but this was different. This was personal. The thought that someone within his own family had allowed such a breach of trust was almost unbearable. But he knew what had to be done. The monarchy could not afford to allow this betrayal to go unpunished. The consequences of doing nothing would be far worse than confronting the truth, no matter how difficult it was. Finally, after a long silence, the king spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a hardness to it that Catherine had not heard before. He acknowledged the gravity of the situation and the damage that had been done, not just to the royal family, but to the memory of Diana herself. The king knew that action had to be taken, but he also understood the delicate nature of the decision. The person responsible for this scandal was someone very close to him, and removing them from their position would have profound implications for the royal household. Catherine and William both understood what the king was saying. The decision was not an easy one, but it had to be made. The person behind the thefts, the person who had violated the trust of the royal family and sold off Diana's legacy, had to be held accountable. But who would take the fall? Who could the king trust to do what was necessary without causing irreparable harm to the family? The king's gaze shifted from Catherine to William, and for a moment, there was no mistaking the pain in his eyes. He had always been protective of his family, but now he had to make a decision that would affect the entire monarchy. He could no longer protect those who had betrayed the family. It was clear that the person responsible was someone who had crossed a line that could not be ignored. After a few more moments of silence, the king made his decision. He looked at Catherine and William and told them that he would take action. The person responsible for the theft of the jewels would be confronted, and their involvement in the scheme would be made public. The king knew that this decision would have far-reaching consequences, but he also knew that the integrity of the monarchy and the trust of his sons had to come first. The following day, a meeting was arranged at Buckingham Palace. The king, Catherine, and William would confront the person responsible for the thefts. It was clear that this was a moment that would define the future of the royal family. The betrayal was not just a personal matter, it was an institutional one. The monarchy's reputation had been tarnished, and only by taking decisive action could they hope to restore trust and protect the legacy of Diana. As Catherine and William prepared for the confrontation, they both knew that this would be a defining moment for their family. The royal family had weathered many scandals over the years, but this one felt different. This was about more than just jewels. It was about legacy, trust, and the very foundations of the monarchy. The decision made that day would set the course for the royal family for years to come. After the king's decision, the royal family prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The atmosphere in Buckingham Palace had shifted, and there was a sense of unease hanging in the air. The next steps would change the course of the family's internal dynamics, and the repercussions of what had happened would be felt far beyond the palace walls. This was no longer just about missing jewelry. It was about a betrayal that had shaken the very foundations of the monarchy, a breach of trust that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Catherine, William, and the king knew that the time had come to act. The person responsible for the theft of Diana's jewels would be confronted. Their actions, once hidden in the shadows, would be brought into the light. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or whispers. It was a matter of undeniable truth, backed by evidence that could not be ignored. But as much as the confrontation was necessary, it would also be difficult. The person at the center of this betrayal was someone very close to the royal family, someone who had long been a part of their lives. The emotions tied to this situation were complicated, but the king's resolve remained firm. The monarchy's integrity had to come first, no matter how painful the process. The meeting was set for the evening, long after the usual palace activities had ceased. The private study, where many important decisions had been made over the years, was chosen as the location for this critical moment. The air in the room was thick with tension as Catherine and William arrived, their faces calm but their minds racing. They knew what was at stake. The gravity of the situation was not lost on them. This wasn't just a matter of recovering stolen jewels. It was about protecting the memory of Diana and ensuring that those who had violated the trust of the royal family would be held accountable. When the person at the center of the scandal arrived, there was a certain calmness in their demeanor. They walked into the room with the same air of confidence they always had, as though nothing had changed. But the moment they sat down, the truth was laid bare. Catherine, with a firm but steady voice, began to outline the evidence. She presented the correspondence, the auction catalogs, the appraisals, everything that had been uncovered in the investigation. There was no denying it. The stolen jewels had been sold at private auctions, and the person responsible had been at the center of it all. At first, the person attempted to deflect the accusations, offering explanations that seemed rehearsed, even implausible. They spoke of valuations, insurance updates, and other justifications that had little weight given the overwhelming evidence. But the more Catherine spoke, the clearer it became that these explanations were nothing more than a smokescreen. The royal jewels had been taken with intent, sold for personal gain, and hidden from those who had a right to protect them. The betrayal was undeniable. The king, who had remained silent up until this point, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to it that made the weight of his words all the more profound. He acknowledged the pain of the situation, both for the family and for the monarchy as a whole. But he made it clear that there could be no place for betrayal in the royal family. The consequences of this breach were far-reaching, and no amount of explanation could erase the damage that had been done. The decision was made swiftly. The person responsible for the thefts would no longer be involved in the day-to-day affairs of the royal family. Their role, once integral to the royal household, would be drastically reduced. They would be asked to vacate their quarters at Buckingham Palace and move to a lesser residence, one that would reflect their diminished status. Public duties would be suspended, and any involvement with royal assets would be permanently revoked. Though they would retain their title, their influence would be stripped away. The gravity of the decision was not lost on anyone in the room. There were no celebrations, no feelings of triumph. Instead, there was a quiet sense of finality. The monarchy had been forced to confront its own internal vulnerabilities, and in doing so, it had to take action to protect its future. The individual in question listened in silence, absorbing the consequences of their actions. There was no real denial, no attempt to justify their behavior further. They knew, deep down, that the decision had been made. The king's words, though firm, lacked the anger that might have been expected. This was not a moment of rage. It was a moment of resolve. The trust that had been shattered could never be fully restored. But the family had to move forward, united in the face of this scandal. As the meeting came to a close, the individual left the room, escorted out of the palace by a senior aide. The air in the room felt heavier than it had before, as though the palace itself had borne witness to a painful but necessary decision. Catherine and William exchanged a brief glance, one that spoke volumes. The betrayal had been addressed, but the impact of it would be felt for some time. The king, now alone with his thoughts, sat in the quiet of the study, reflecting on the decision he had just made. The palace had been shaken, but it would endure. The monarchy would survive this crisis, as it had survived so many others. But the damage had been done, and the trust that had been broken would take time to rebuild. The family would need to heal, and the legacy of Diana would need to be protected, no matter the cost. As the day drew to a close, the palace slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But those who knew the true story, those who understood the weight of the decisions made, knew that things had changed forever. Diana's jewels had been returned to the royal vaults, safe and secure once again. But the true cost of the betrayal would not soon be forgotten.